Prior to the release of Backrooms, I saw this clip of Kane Parson discussing the influences he had while creating his film.
Portal would be the earliest influences. The easiest one for me to pin down is like the strongest influence over like everything I've done in my entire life, probably.
And I was immediately sold. The prospect of a filmmaker citing direct inspiration from a video game was so compelling, and something I hadn't seen used in the Letterboxd Top 4 format before, I got my ticket that weekend and went to see the film. And I can confirm, yes, you can see the influence of the Portal games all over the film. The handheld footage looks like the POV of a first-person character. The sparse, almost clinical set design feels aligned to the endless feeling of test chambers in Aperture Science. You could even go as far as to make more subtle connections, like how Aperture was making shower curtains, and Async previously was manufacturing MRI machines, prior to both companies switching focus to testing facilities. Or the use of sound assets from the game.
Do you use the door opening sound effect in Backrooms?
It's very possible.
And birds.
Bird!
But the more I kept thinking about the movie, all these similarities seemed more superficial than anything. Many directors have claimed to have favorite video games.
The best video game you've ever played. Your favorite.
The most immersive has to be BioShock.
I loved Dead Space 3.
Recently I had this crazy Fortnite addiction.
And when you compare these games to their filmography, it checks out. They feel grounded in these directors' filmic language. But I wouldn't consider them foundational influences in the way that Kane Parson speaks about Portal. Because unlike the films from these other directors, Backrooms could not exist without an understanding of video games as a medium. And that goes all the way back to the 4chan post that first brought Backrooms into the public zeitgeist. If you're not careful, and you no-clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the Backrooms. Approximately 600 million square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms to be trapped in. This was the caption that accompanied the picture that inspired Backrooms, and there's a very specific use of language here. You don't get into the Backrooms by teleporting or phasing through. You get there by no-clipping out of reality.
It's not hell. It's not even like quite purgatory because you don't do anything to end up there. It just randomly happens and you can't really do anything to get out. It's just
what
like
you said, a procedural dungeon run.
Yeah, it's just a hypothetical, like, it's playing into the feeling of glitching and getting stuck in a video game, basically.
Exactly,
and it's like,
right.
There's no fairness in it. It's just like, that really sucks if that happens to you.
No-clipping is a video game cheat command that removes collision detection, essentially giving walls and obstacles that would previously stop the player character the ability to be walked through. This was primarily for game developers to troubleshoot and test their games. While walking through walls or subverting a game's collision geometry existed previously, the use of the term no-clipping first shows up in ID Software's Commander Keen: Secret of the Oracle. Interestingly, in that game, if you enable no-clipping on in the debug mode and wander off the map, the player will be punished by losing a life. And enabling no-clipping while inside a level will cause you to simply fall through the screen. Odd visual glitches can also happen when an engine minimizes resource usage based on a player's position. If you enable free camera and go to an area your character is not currently loaded into, assets can look distorted because they are not built to load fully without the input of a player character in view. You could say they look like if you tried to describe a villager NPC to someone who had never seen a villager NPC and then asked them to draw it. Something like that. So while no-clipping in video games results in a lot of visual similarities to things that happen in Kane Parson's Backrooms, it doesn't fully explore why an understanding of this video game language is so necessary to create a film that fully realizes the concept of the Backrooms. For that, understanding no-clipping's relation to liminality is fundamental.
When I first heard of no-clipping, which isn't an internet legend or anything or a creepypasta, but it was, when I was playing years and years ago, it's like 20-something years ago, I'd play on the games like Doom. There was this game called Doom, which was like the first sort of, shooter point of view, shooter game, and there was, you'd hear these stories of being able to move through all the levels and just sort of no-clip through all the levels if you put in the right cheat code, if you pressed up 5 times and then to the left and then to the right. And I think it was like, just having that, which was in the back of my mind somewhere, I'd probably forgotten where, but just having something like that pulled together with an urban legend, pulled together with a creepypasta, pulled together with the internet, it felt very sort of multi-generational, I would say, in its own way, and I appreciate it.
Kane's generation didn't invent no-clipping as a term or discover its first manifestations. but they saw how it could become a vehicle for the way one could talk about the experience of entering liminal spaces. Liminality, or the concept of liminal space, was gaining traction around the same time as the first Backrooms photo post on 4chan. It represents a transitional space, the in-betweenness of two distinct phases or places. Liminality requires that sense of unease, that a place isn't meant to be occupied, somewhere you feel like you could have been before, but you have no actual memories of the place. In his interview with Brooke Marine in New York Magazine, Kane speaks about his feelings towards liminal imagery, stating, "The liminal space images feel like someone went into my brain, found one of the many isolated fragments of a memory from childhood. Like, I remember a few things about what happened, but I have no clue when that was, or I have no clue where that was. That's the thing that gets people. I lean very hard into the sci-fi of it. I like to treat the liminal space as a force of nature. Some people refer to it as a video game glitch. It's not a form of damnation or a trial of the soul, it's incidental and can occur to anyone, and not something you can debate your way out of morally or logically." And by looking at Portal through Kane's interpretation of liminality, it's easy to see why he would find the infrastructure of Aperture Science's test facility to mirror the Backrooms.
The general set construction of the Portal games is something that's been in my brain for so long. I frequently have dreams where I'm just in the Aperture Research Center.
When the player wakes up in Portal, it is not because they have been captured or sent to the facility as a form of punishment. In fact, there are many pieces of lore that leads fans to theorize that the main character opted voluntarily to be a test subject. Playing the game feels like walking through hundreds of miles of continuous rooms, some that seem to shift and change their arrangement as you navigate from portal to portal. By nature of being a puzzle game, there are long stretches where you sit with your thoughts, thinking how you can best use your limited resources and fragmented understanding of the environment to find escape.
In a lot of ways, it feels like an internal indoors that goes on in all directions that is just absurd in its scope. So I think it's actually very similar to Backrooms in that front.
In Portal 2, you fall through the floor to enter the true backrooms of the facility, the original Aperture Science Institute from the 1950s, buried beneath the testing chambers you woke up in. The architecture of the space in both the Portal games and Backrooms film exists as its own character. There are long scenes in the film where the viewer is watching every agonizing step as the backrooms are being explored, not unlike the way you take up space and interact with your environment in a video game world. Kane feels focused on this isolation because of his time spent in sandbox games.
I think that's where I actually would have begun using the term no clip.
No clipping, kind of moving through physical
Yeah,
objects
within Source.
in
Whenever I
space.
wanted to go find the cake at the end of Portal or something, I would go down to the basement and I would find it.
If you want to experience a true sense of liminality in video games, that space is best articulated through the out-of-bounds corners of the game map. Finding ways to access these closed-off spaces developers never intended a player to see lends itself a true feeling of being in a space you were never intended to go. Assets are frozen in time, waiting to be activated by a player character's input. They hang in that in-between space of existing before being interacted with. The cake room Kane references is a room that is shown before the credits roll on the game. The player character never enters this room, never interacts with the cake. But due to the way that world building works in video game engines, everything that can be seen by a player will exist somewhere out of bounds in the map, if you're able to find a way to no-clip through the boundaries and traverse there. Whole communities are dedicated to finding unused map geometry.
I grew up playing environment-based sandbox games and whatnot, so I'm so inherently focused on world building in a very literal context that I think my brain just is kind of a little wired to be sympathetic to places.
This sort of unsanctioned traversal can conjure the same feelings of uncanniness as liminal space. I found a Reddit user who made a post expressing their discomfort going out of bounds, saying, "Deep, uncanny fear when out of bounds in a game. Anyone ever experienced this? Or just funky feelings about being in a game world?" And many other users chimed in to express similar discomfort. Glitch fear is a huge thing for me in gaming. A game is trying to convince you of being a real world, and things like those glitches or exploits challenge all known rules of physics and reality. That's why the use of language is so important and can elicit the exact unsettling atmosphere the Backrooms would have, because the experience itself is rooted in something tangible for people who are familiar with the term. In the same interview with New York Magazine mentioned earlier, Kane says, "I hate to be so simplistic about it, but I guess for me, my interest didn't start from me going to a theater as a kid and having stars in my eyes and being like, I want to make movies because I love movies. The weird thing is, growing up online, there's so many random inspirations that I watch and then never find again. And I think this experience is actually what is pivotal for why Kane's Backrooms film feels the way it does. And I would argue this experience is not entirely unique to Kane. He's just the person who's put his influence into words right now. I've seen film analysts point to the influence of prolific filmmakers like David Lynch and Stanley Kubrick on the look and feel of Backrooms. But when directly asked if this was the case, Kane almost sheepishly admits that it wasn't.
I think in truth there wasn't a lot of specificity in like referencing certain elements I haven't seen in the majority of Lynch's work. My dad, he's a big fan of Twin Peaks, so he so it's like I grew up kind of in that space a little bit, literally that. But that's anecdotal,
that
and
so much.
I need to grow a little bit more of an appreciation for it.
His dad was a fan, and by osmosis, Kane may have internalized some visual motifs that have gone on to appear in his own work. But to me, it sounds more like a kid who grew up with his dad's favorite films and shows, but engaging with it in the same way I know all the lyrics to Sunday Bloody Sunday because my mom's favorite band is U2. Not a conscious choice, but perhaps a formative factor all the same. I get the same impression when watching his interview with director James Wan for the A24 podcast.
Nothing about this was grand or like hyper compelling because I was like 9 and 10, and none of this was.
Wow. Okay, so you were doing all this around 9 or 10-ish years old.
Yeah, but what I guess I would highlight is like it's no different than what I think most of my peers were doing. Like even people who don't have a desire to go into art fields, it was like building stuff in Minecraft creative mode.
James is a director from the film school generation, graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Media in 1999, 6 years before Kane was even born. He's so impressed with hearing that Kane was 9 or 10 creating in these sandbox worlds, and Kane's kind of trying to explain how it's no big deal. It's an almost mundane experience for his generation.
I think that's really interesting that you didn't actually necessarily go down the path of, hey, I want to be a video game maker. But you sort of stuck to storytelling, filmmaking, but using the craft that you had the passion and you had acquired to kind of assist you in your filmmaking.
And this is where we get to my most controversial argument in this essay. Kane doesn't seem like a capital G gamer, despite how often he is asked about his history of playing video games. To me, that actually makes what is happening with his creative process of Backrooms all the more interesting. A comment he made in a Smosh Alike interview kind of brought me to this conclusion as well.
Do you like Cyberpunk 2077?
I haven't had time to play it.
And this isn't brought up to get derailed into some hyperbolic, if you're passionate about video games, you've obviously played Cyberpunk. Instead, it highlights the time suck that is video games as a hobby. Playing games takes significant investment, and Kane notes he's very busy with his other passions. The Smosh Alike crew even press him further to ask what he does in his spare time.
Okay, let's say you're decompressing, but it's not for work.
Music. I make music.
It's a lot of work.
The games Kane cites as his influences are short and immersive. You can log onto Minecraft or Gary's Mod and play with friends for a short time and get a fulfilling experience. Portal 1 can be completed in 2 to 3 hours. In the dwindling attention economy, it makes sense that these would be more of a draw for young audiences, as opposed to a 100+ hour single-player narrative game, or the 55 hours it would take to watch the entire Twin Peaks franchise. Up-and-coming directors, by the nature of this changing landscape of shared culture, will have similar influences. At this point, video games have been introduced into school curriculum with things like Minecraft Education, where you enter worlds specific to teaching immersive lessons, and Portal 2's Teach with Portals that includes an educational puzzle maker for students to experiment with physics and problem solving. And this sort of sensibility and understanding of video games as they relate to visual storytelling will become more pronounced as new directors enter the industry, I suspect.
The audience that I speak to is the audience that I'm also a part of, which I think is maybe why I've had a decent rhythm with them.
Kane built his version of the Backrooms through an understanding of video game design and also the time he spent just existing on the internet. Before Kane's version on YouTube, there was a large community of people creating lore and crowdsourcing the history of the Backrooms. And while Kane has his own direction and story to tell within Backrooms, it is worth acknowledging that this huge community is not unlike the communities of lore seekers and explorers in sandbox titles, building levels and mythos as it grows. Using VFX tools like Blender even mirror gaming itself. The software could be described as free to play, and the tool's interface has an approachable puzzle-like composition system that renders out locations to look like out-of-bounds maps in free camera mode. The Blender aesthetic has seeped into Backrooms lore with tutorials from other creators explaining how to get the Backrooms look and feel through the software. Blender is also becoming a staple for asset creation in the video game industry. 3 of the nominees for 2025's Best Debut Indie Game at the Game Awards, Blueprints, Expedition 33, and Despelote, all use Blender in some capacity. But what does all of this have to do with the future of film? And why does Portal, and video games in general, and their influence on Kane Parsons, feel so significant towards this shift? And I think in many ways, it all comes back to his Letterboxd Top 4 interview. As creatives, we are the sum of everything we have seen, experienced, and interacted with. And it's how we shape these inspirations into something unique that makes compelling art. Hearing Kane cite Portal as a main and pivotal inspiration to his filmmaking is refreshing. It rejects the idea that art should be created within the vacuum of its medium. I've never had a conversation with Kane. Everything I know comes from watching him discuss his process through interviews. So a lot of this comes down to hypothesizing. But I think it's fair to say that if a future generation of filmmakers first fell in love with storytelling through video games, it will reflect in how they execute their craft. This is why I felt it important to highlight how, in Kane's own words, he expresses how ordinary playing video games feels for himself and his peers. Backrooms as a film has a plot. Clark and Mary are characters whose stories we follow, but narrative-wise, that feels secondary to the environmental storytelling that is done through the creation of the world of Backrooms. In the Portal games, environmental storytelling is the main avenue for navigating the plot of the game. Many players will play through the entire game without recognizing the protagonist even has a name. But through the force of exploration, of noticing details that aren't explicit, the player experiences the story. I don't think Kane was specifically trying to reference or mimic video game mechanics in his film. He's more a catalyst to explore how when you're immersed in your influences, these connections just become innate. By confirming the validity of this, we can embrace a generation of filmmakers who may have references in their work read as Lynch or Kubrick, but will instead be Valve and Mojang Studios. And I hope that when we look to the future of film, it begins to interpret what is so fundamental about video games, the way they use immersion to make you feel something profound. And if that's the future of film we're looking towards, I can't help but be excited about what will come next.
It's beautiful. Am I right?